Hello. Today I'm going to show you how to paint some simple patterns and effects in watercolour for use as backgrounds. But first I want to introduce myself. My name's Susie Johns. You may already know me from books I've written on knitting and crochet and sewing, but I'm also an art teacher at a local college, and just like other colleges, it's had to close for the time being. But I promised my students that I would do some online tutorials just to help them, keep them motivated. And so this is one of them, how to paint watercolour backgrounds. They're very simple to do and fun, just using watercolour paints and a few other materials. And they can be used for all sorts of things, but I intend to use them to make some ATCs, which is artists trading cards, and I'll save that for another video. But let's get started. I'm going to start today by just running through the materials that we'll be using to make these watercolour backgrounds. They're some brushes, flat wash brush, a round brush, they're both sables. There's a rigger brush and a sword liner, some wax crayons. This is Brusho, which is a kind of powdered watercolour, very intense, and there's a little water spray to activate it. A craft knife, tissue for mopping up and blotting. Some watercolour pencils, water-soluble pencils. A little bit of bubble wrap there and a small sponge. And then a template which I've cut from acetate, and a tube of white gouache. So I'm going to start by drawing around the template, which is cut to the size of an ATC, which is 3.5 inches by 2.5 inches. That's 9 by 6 centimetres more or less. And it's the size of a standard artist's trading card. I'm leaving a little gap in between because when I'm going to be painting the watercolour, it's going to go over the edges. I'm not going to stick to the lines, and this gives a little margin for cutting out the cards when they're finished, when they're dry. So this fits, on this piece of paper I can fit 18. Here are some that I did earlier, and this is the sort of thing we're going to be doing. Nice bright splashes of watercolour, which are excellent backgrounds for your artist trading cards. So we'll begin by wetting the first one. I'm using a nice flat sable brush with some clean water and just wetting the whole area that I'm going to paint. Then I'm going to be mixing up some watercolours. I'm going to start with a nice opera rose colour and just dot it into the wet area, the area that you've just wetted. And you can see that the colour is starting to spread into the wettened paper. Now I'm adding a little bit of cadmium red, a few dots, and they're going to spread as well. Eventually the paint will spread to cover the entire area that you've covered with water. And we've got some lemon yellow going in. Make sure the paint isn't too watery. It needs to be a nice intense colour, I think. And finally we're going to go in with some turquoise blue. Again, just using the tip of the brush to add little dots of colour where you can see some bits of white paper showing. I'm going to wet the second one now, just in the same way with a flat brush and some nice clean water. This time we're going to do some washes of colour, some bands of colour that will run into one another. I'm going to start this one with some transparent mauve, which is a nice reddish purple, pinkish purple. And then I'm going to go in with some permanent rose, that's one of my favourite colours, followed by a little stripe of the opera pink. And then just to finish off, a nice band of lemon yellow. Nice bright colours, and you'll see that they will just, the edges will blur, there won't be hard edges between these colours, they'll blur together quite nicely. Now we're still doing wet in wet, so that means covering the third rectangle with some nice clean water. All of these techniques are wet in wet, wet paint into a wet paper background, using cerulean blue here, and I've just loaded up the brush with the colour, and I've just started at the top and just painted bands, and they naturally just get lighter towards the bottom. I'm just going to leave that one as a plain background. Now I'm picking up a white wax crayon, just an ordinary wax crayon, and I'm just going to draw little circles with this on the dry paper. What this does is the wax produces a resist. Where the wax goes, the paint will not penetrate the wax, and so you'll keep the white of the paper. It's quite handy to carry around a white wax crayon in your watercolour kit, just for this very purpose, just to preserve the white paper. And this is just a bit of fun, really, just drawing these little circles. You'll see, you can't see them very well at the moment, but you'll see what happens when we apply some nice wet paint. So we're going to start off with cadmium red at the top. I'm just stroking this over the paper, over the dry paper, and there you can see where the white wax crayon is. I'll put some permanent rose next, and some cadmium yellow, nice bright yellow. Little stripe of lemon yellow to finish. You'll see that I do enjoy the combination of pink and yellow, it's lovely and bright. Now on the dry paper, I'm going to have a band of permanent mauve, and then some ultramarine blue, and some cerulean blue to finish off. This one's a bit more experimental because I'm going to use a little piece of bubble wrap just pressed into the paint. And sometimes it works really well, and sometimes it's not so exciting. It does depend on the wetness of the paint. For the next one, I'm also going to just work on the dry paper, and I've dipped my little natural sponge into some colour. I think there was some blue on the sponge already because I've dipped into yellow, but it looks a bit greenish, but we'll go with that. You can just combine, 2, 3, 4 colours from your palette. Just keep dipping the sponge in. There's a bit of red, it's rather wet. A little bit drier so you get more of a mottled effect. You can get so many different effects with a small natural sponge. Yep, some yellow. It's going to look quite nice. Yeah, I like the mottled effect that gives. I think the thing is not to overdo this, just to keep it quite light. I'm trying to cover the white of the paper, but I'm not trying to put too many layers on. Now I'm just going in with my rigger brush. It's got lovely long bristles, and I've just dipped it into a bit of sort of Prussian blue paint that I had on my palette. I'm just allowing the brush just to lightly touch the paper. I think I might go in with a bit of a darker colour. This paint is called neutral tone, neutral tint, and it's a sort of greyish colour. And you can see that I'm just barely letting the paintbrush touch the paper. I'm just trying to go for these almost marbling sort of marks, little veins running across the whole area. Just gives it kind of a sort of, yeah, kind of feeling of marble in a way. Or maybe autumn trees. You can interpret it whichever way you like. I want to create another sort of mottled effect now, and for this one I'm going to use my watercolour pencils, and I'm just using the craft knife just to sort of scrape the top of the pencil, just to create a kind of powder, little grains of watercolour pencil. You can use any combination of colours for this. I must admit I do tend to stick to my primary colours of red and yellow and blue, because I think they work very well. So I'm just scraping the colour onto the paper. There's a bit of blue here going on. You don't really need very much of this. Just scraping it on. A little bit of pale green. And for the next one, I'm going to be using the little pots of Brusho that I showed you at the beginning of this video. I've got rose red, a little bit of rose red. I'm just sprinkling a little bit, just using the tip of my craft knife just to pick it up out of the pot and just sprinkle it on. Yeah, I'm using 4 colours: rose red, ultramarine, lemon and burnt sienna. And I'm using those colours because they're the only 4 I've got in this particular product. Overspilt there, so I'm just going to scrape that bit of powder back onto the area that I'm working on. I'm also using the tip of the knife just to spread out the powder. There's a bit of the ultramarine blue going on there. Just spreading it out a little bit. Now both of these powders don't look like much at the moment, but they're going to be activated by spraying them with a little bit of water. You can use just tap water in a little spray bottle. You can buy those from the chemist, little spray bottles, or I'm just using this aerosol bottle of water because I had it to hand. And if you just gently spray, you'll see the colour will spread out and start to mingle and blend with each other. The watercolour pencils, the effect varies depending on sort of pencils that you use. And I'm just sort of brushing the colour, just dispersing the colour here with a sword liner brush, which is a nice brush. It's got a sort of, it's got a mind of its own really. It's quite, but it's quite dainty, and it'll spread the colour nicely without blending it together too much. Now I'm going to spray the Brusho, and you'll see the difference. It's very intense. It's got a very intense colour. And the colours are sort of, as I add more water, the colours you can see are turning into sort of fireworks and blending together. And I'm just going to use the wrong end of the paintbrush, the tip of the handle this time, just to disperse the colour, just to spread it out a bit. You can get some nice effects like this, but I think you have to be prepared sometimes for it not to work as well as you'd want it to. It's sort of got a mind of its own. It's you know, something you can just play with and experiment with. So those are 8 techniques that you might like to try. I think that I've used very bright colours. You could just as easily use softer colours, but remember they do dry a little bit paler than you put them on. Let's see what happened to the bubble wrap. Oh, it's quite nice. It's made quite a nice sort of effect. So we've done 8 squares so far, rectangles. Here's another one using the Brusho. This time I've put the yellow in the middle, little circle of the red dust around it, and then some of the ultramarine blue. And once again, I'm just going in with the end of the brush, just drawing out the colour, sort of scraping it out. The rest of the rectangles, I'm just going to be using the same techniques we've used for the first ones, but I'm just going to try and experiment with some different colours, just to show you that, you know, you can get all sorts of different effects just with these simple techniques. So, you know, the wet on wet technique, the wax resist, which I'm going to do now. I used a white wax crayon before. I've got a few more very pale colours here. There's a sort of very, very pale peach you can hardly see, and here's a very pale lime green. Then I'm going in with a little pink shade as well. I've chosen colours that are very pale because you don't, well, I don't want them to overtake the paint, and sticking to circles because it's just a nice simple pattern, simple thing to do. Anyone can do it, and you know, once you've mastered the technique, then you can go on to other things. A few more green circles, there's a few gaps there. Get my round brush, and there's a bit of cadmium red. That's lemon yellow. Make sure you wash your brush in nice clean water in between so that you keep the colours nice and pure. That's a transparent turquoise I'm using there. Finish off that little corner just with a bit of ultramarine blue. It's a nice colour, ultramarine. So I'm wetting the paper. Again, though, when I started this demo, I had nice clean water, and it's got a little bit tinged with paint at the moment, but we'll go with it. So this is like the first one I did, which is up in the top left-hand corner. And I'm going in with dots of transparent turquoise. Oh, there's a hair. Let's get rid of that. And another one. Just scrape that off with my knife. Some dots of ultramarine now. We'll keep this one in shades of blue, I think. A little bit of permanent mauve. Just dotting this in the gaps in between the other colours. And this is a few dots of the neutral tint, which is a nice dark neutral colour. You could probably hear my granddaughter then running around in the corridor outside. These little dark dots of neutral tint. Just give it a bit of depth. So I'm going to paint some colour bands again. On this bottom left I'll just wet the paper, just that little area. Again, you can see that what was plain water has got a bit dirty now, but the cadmium red's still nice and bright. There's a stripe of cadmium red, and then a stripe of cadmium yellow, and once again the wet paper is allowing the colours to the edges of the colours to run into each other. Got a bit of phthalo green just below that band of cadmium. I'm just getting my rigger brush now and just running it down the damp paint, just to encourage that red, also pull it into the other stripes. There's the other end of the brush, the handle end as well, that can create some nice effects. So I'm wetting the next rectangle. And loading my brush with that neutral tint, that dark, that really sort of dark colour. I'm just going to use it at full strength just at the top, but then dilute it a little bit, so that we get this nice sort of ombre effect. I can see that my brush has gone into the green of the previous one, so I'm getting a little bit of green just bleeding into that grey. Looks quite nice. I think I'll leave it. And I'm just getting a bit of screwed up tissue now, just a clean tissue, and just using that just to blot a little bit of the colour. Just blot little tiny areas. It almost looks like sort of snow or stars or something like that. It can be quite a nice effect. So simple to do. The next one I'm going to do is going to be with sponge again. I'm just mixing up some nice wet colour, little puddles of colour on my palette. Then I'm going to pick up a little sponge. That's the opera rose. Nice bright pink. And a little puddle of the permanent mauve as well. I'm just going to pick up the colour on my sponge and just dab it. I'm being a bit more heavy-handed than I was with the one above, the previous one that I did with the sponge. Just see what happens. There's a bit of opera rose. And stick it straight into the colour. A bit more intense colour. Lemon yellow. And that's cadmium red. Just tapping the paintbrush just to create a few splatters. Try just flicking it a bit. Get a few little red spots. So for the next one, I'm going to carry on with that cadmium red. It's lovely bright red. And I'm just going to paint just a fairly rich background and then just leave it. So it's cadmium red. I think I'll use a bit of opera rose as well, which is lovely and bright. And I'm going to leave that to dry a little bit and come back to it. And the one next to it, I'll do a similar thing, only a different range of colours. I'll use transparent turquoise, nice and rich, not too much water, and some ultramarine blue, and a bit of that neutral tint, that colour that's almost black. And I'm going to leave those to dry and just get some clean water on my brush again, on the wash brush, and just got 2 more to go. So this one I'm going to dot with colour again. Some cadmium yellow. Bit of opera rose. I love that colour combination of the pink and the yellow. And now for some bright red. This is Windsor red. Just slightly different from the cadmium red. Nice and bright and rich. And that's going to flow nicely into those other colours. So we have one rectangle remaining. I think we'll do another one similar with the dots of colour. Such fun to do. So let's just wet it with clean water, and we'll begin with some dots of cadmium yellow. Bit of lemon yellow. And some transparent turquoise. While I'm doing this, I can just notice that the rectangle above this one has started flowing in a really lovely way. It looks very sort of marbled, the reds and the yellows. So I'm just going to pick up a paintbrush and just encourage that a little bit more. Just draw those colours down in a sort of feathery way. So while I'm waiting for the bright red and the dark blue areas at the bottom, on the bottom row, to dry off a little bit more, I'm just going to add a bit of blue, a bit of ultramarine blue, just to those little wax resist circles, just to lift that one up a bit. Just dotting the blue inside the little circles, inside the little wax circles. Okay, so it's time to add something to that, those two that I've left at the bottom. At the beginning I showed you a tube of white gouache, so this is the time to use that. So I've loaded up the sword liner with some white gouache, and the dark blue paint is still a little bit damp, so as I just draw this paint through with the sword liner, it just slightly dissolves and bleeds into the dark blue. You'll see it happening now, and it just creates this lovely feathering effect, which I rather like. I'm going to just spatter a few drops of gouache as well, just tap the paintbrush and just spatter a few little white drops, and they're going to slightly disperse into the damp paint. And I've got a little bit of the white gouache left on my palette, and what I'm going to do now is just scrape it up with the craft knife, and then I'm going to spread it onto that red square, just to use up the last of the paint and not let that bit of white paint go to waste. Just using the knife blade just to spread it out. You could use a palette knife instead if you prefer. And yeah, let's just see what happens with that one. The red paint is pretty much dry actually, and so the white sits on top quite nicely. So that's all the painting done. We've completed 18 different little backgrounds there, and all that remains is for the paint to be left to dry. So just to recap, we've got the wet in wet sections. We've got some wax resist using wax crayons, the Brusho powdered pigment, more wax resist, just some wet in wet splodginess there, different colours That's the Brusho again. The watercolour pencils just scraped onto the paper. Sponging with a bit of veining added with a brush. Bubble wrap pressed into some wet paint. Some more wet in wet. Some little lifting out using a tissue, sponging again. This is some white gouache spread over red paint, white gouache just in some damp blue paint, and another wet in wet. All that remains now is to leave them to dry. When they're completely dry, I can cut them out. And I'm going to do this, I'm going to cut them out just roughly, not around the pencil lines that I've drawn, but just leaving a margin of paper all around, because I might want to add things to them before completing them as an ATC. So I might want to do some stamping, some collage, that kind of thing on top of the paint. And so I'll trim them when I'm ready to do so. So there's 18 cards that I've made today, and I'll put those with the ones I made earlier, and I'm all ready to start making some ATCs. So thank you for watching, and if you've enjoyed it, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button, and I'll be making some more videos in the next days and weeks. Thank you.